In the last 8 years, the big four of Tokusatsu have undergone a change in the way they are built, one that for long-term fans has often been the subject of debate. What change is that, you might ask? Well, it's the introduction of gimmick toy lines. Now, Toku was no stranger to gimmicks before this. Way back in its third installment, Super Sentai began featuring a giant robot called a mech as the centerpiece of its toy line every year. Then when it came time for the franchise's fifth installment, they introduced the concept of a robot that was formed from multiple smaller vehicles called Mecha. Not long after that, it became commonplace for there to be add-on vehicles and even whole other robots that could combine with the main one. But for a long time, this was as far as it went, until 2009's Kamen Rider Decade. That series perfected the modern version of the concept of a rider who gets his powers from an object that is inserted into his belt, which had been introduced a few years earlier in Kamen Rider Ryuki. This version of the concept consisted of selling the belt toy with only a few of the gimmick items that could be used, and then including the others with other roleplay toys in the line, and later on also selling packs of them on their own. This proved to be extremely profitable for Toei and Bandai. Because of that, the concept would go on to be expanded on in future Rider shows and incorporated into the Super Sentai series. Samurai Sentai Shinkenger were given secret discs, Saban brands adapted that idea with Power Ranger Samurai's Power Discs, and Subaraya Productions' Ultra series followed with Ultraman Ginga's Spark Dolls. While there have been a few exceptions like Dobutsu Sentai Zyuohger, which built the look of its show around a cube motif but didn't feature any cube gimmick items, the gimmick item concept continued to the point where it is now as much of a mainstay of the medium as rubber suit monsters and spandex-clad heroes. This concept being so widespread has led to a lot of fans on various forums being upset and claiming that the constant introduction of new gimmick items can make a show's story feel bogged down and overly commercialized. And while I do understand why people would feel this way, I really don't agree with it. From day one, most of these franchises have been about selling toys. If they weren't, the original shows probably wouldn't have been made. So, to complain that the show takes more of a break now to show you a new toy you can buy just doesn't make much sense to me. What I do have a problem with, though, is when the reason for constantly having new gimmick items isn't well incorporated into the story. This is something Toei struggled with early on by doing things like giving the main writer all his gimmick items in the pilot and then saying they were a one-time only in the pilot and now he'll have to earn all but his main powers back by meeting and teaming up with all the past writers one by one in Kamen Rider Decade. Showing their hand early on like this kinda ruined that aspect of later episodes of Decade, making almost every scene where he got a new power set almost completely skippable. But eventually they learned from that mistake and started building the stories of each show around finding, earning, or creating the items one by one until the final arc, and for the most part that worked. Except for the odd show like Kamen Rider Ghost, where in the first episode it's stated that the main character needs to find 15 of the show's gimmick items in order to achieve his goal of coming back to life, making us think that there will be 15 total items plus a few exclusive ones for the secondary writer whenever he shows up, and then not only do they get that number of items very fast, but they continue to get new ones that have nothing to do with their original theme of being a manifestation of a historical figure's soul. Fortunately, the next series, Exade, corrected this by making all of the items video games and the forms obtained by using them different levels for each of the writers, thus continuously having all of the characters on a quest for more power trying to one-up each other. This is often my preferred method of doing gimmick items in a show's story, but it's not the only one that works. In KAIZOKU Sentai GOKAIGER, our heroes have most of the Ranger keys right away because their fighting style is all about being showy by constantly changing into different Sentai teams from the past and using their powers in creative ways. And later on in the show, they obtain the keys for all the 6 Rangers and extra heroes by fighting and beating Bosco multiple times. This works because the story of GOKAIGER isn't about finding the keys and gaining new abilities that way, but rather by unlocking each Sentai's grand power by earning the team's approval, which gets them power-ups for their giant robot based on the past team's powers. This works so much better than in other seasons and a certain adaptation of this show that shall not be named, where, for the most part, characters will often be given their new gimmick item by a mentor figure because that character has decided they earned it this episode. Which, as stated in my videos on said adaptation that shall not be named, makes no sense because if the item in question is supposed to be more powerful than the ones they already have, why not give it to them from the onset so that when they get to this point they wouldn't be in any danger? Sure, from time to time shows will explain it by saying that it's dangerous to use and they didn't want to bring it into the field unless they had to, but in terms of writing that just barely qualifies as a good excuse to me. So as you can see, gimmick items have become a big part of what can make a tokusatsu story good or bad, and one that I'm very opinionated about. Because while they are good fun, I think it's important to consider whether they help or hinder the story and then vote with your wallet. Because if you don't, you might accidentally end up sending the creative heads behind the show a message saying you're okay with lackluster storytelling. Which really is the last thing I want anyone working in the medium to think, and I hope the same can be said of you. So how about taking a vote with your wallet right now and saying how much you enjoy my content by pledging to my Patreon? Because guess what, kids? I'm moving again. In fact, I'm probably loading stuff on the truck as you're listening to this. The last time I moved, it forced me to take a break from all this for quite a bit, and I don't expect this time to be much different in that regard. So when I do come back, seeing the vote of confidence from you will mean a lot. And hey, if you're interested in any of the rewards I'm offering, you'll get something out of it too.